Question 1. When evaluating potential vulnerabilities for a simulated penetration testing engagement within the OSCP examination context, which method best aligns with the principles of responsible disclosure and accurate vulnerability assessment? Option A. Focusing on exploiting any mention of a software component in a vulnerability list without independently verifying its specific version or patch status. Option B. Prioritizing research using official CVE databases and advisories from reputable sources like MITRE and the National Vulnerability Database, NVD, to confirm and understand documented vulnerabilities. Option C. Conducting a broad scan for any publicly available exploit scripts and attempting to run them against target systems without prior research into their validity or applicability. Option D. Relying primarily on recent discussions and exploit code shared on unverified online forums and social media platforms to identify potential weaknesses. Correct answer is B. Prioritizing research using official CVE databases and advisories from reputable sources like MITRE and the National Vulnerability Database, NVD, to confirm and understand documented vulnerabilities. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because the OSCP exam, while practical, operates within a simulated environment. The core challenge lies in applying theoretical knowledge of CVEs and vulnerability research to a practical, albeit simulated, penetration testing engagement, while adhering to the strict ethical and legal boundaries implicitly defined by the OSCP certification's purpose. The exam's focus is on demonstrating technical proficiency and responsible disclosure principles, not on navigating real-world legal frameworks of specific jurisdictions, as the exam itself is a controlled environment. The correct approach represents best professional practice by prioritizing the use of official, reputable CVE databases and advisories. This aligns with the ethical obligation of a penetration tester to rely on verified information. The OSCP curriculum emphasizes understanding and utilizing resources like the National Vulnerability Database, NVD, and MITRE CVE list. This ensures that the vulnerabilities identified are accurate, well-documented, and have associated remediation guidance, which is crucial for effective and responsible penetration testing. This methodical approach minimizes the risk of misinterpreting or acting upon unverified or outdated information, which could lead to incorrect assessments or unnecessary panic. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or unverified forum posts presents significant regulatory and ethical failures. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for established information sources. This could lead to the misidentification of vulnerabilities, wasting valuable time and resources, and potentially reporting non-existent issues. Ethically, it undermines the credibility of the penetration tester and the OSCP certification by promoting unverified claims. Furthermore, acting on unverified information in a real-world scenario could have severe legal repercussions if it leads to unintended consequences or damages. Another incorrect approach, focusing on exploiting the potential asterisk for a vulnerability without confirming its existence through reliable sources, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a premature leap to action without proper validation. It bypasses the critical research phase and can lead to false positives or wasted effort. In a professional context, this approach is inefficient and can damage client trust. It also fails to adhere to the principle of thoroughness expected of a certified professional. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, identify the target system and its components. Second, consult authoritative CVE databases, like NVD MITRE, for known vulnerabilities affecting those components. Third, cross-reference findings with vendor advisories and security bulletins. Fourth, if a potential vulnerability is identified, research its exploitability and impact using reliable sources. Finally, document all findings meticulously, citing the sources of information. This systematic process ensures accuracy, efficiency, and ethical conduct, aligning with the principles of responsible disclosure and professional integrity that the OSCP certification aims to uphold. Question 2. System analysis indicates a recent penetration test has identified several vulnerabilities across a client's network. The penetration tester has access to the National Vulnerability Database, NVD, and ExploitDB. Which approach best facilitates the prioritization of remediation efforts for the client, considering the potential impact of these vulnerabilities? Option A. Prioritize vulnerabilities for which public exploits are readily available on ExploitDB, regardless of their severity score in NVD, as these represent immediate threats. Option B. Prioritize vulnerabilities by correlating CVEs from NVD with exploitability information from ExploitDB, and then assessing the potential business impact of exploitation on the client's critical assets. Option C. Prioritize vulnerabilities based on vendor advisories, focusing on those that vendors have flagged as critical, without needing to consult NVD or ExploitDB. Option D. Prioritize vulnerabilities based on their CVSS score from NVD, focusing on those with the highest scores, and then cross-reference with ExploitDB to confirm public exploit availability. The correct answer is D. Prioritize vulnerabilities based on their CVSS score from NVD, focusing on those with the highest scores, and then cross-reference with ExploitDB to confirm public exploit availability. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing and vulnerability management, prioritizing remediation efforts based on identified vulnerabilities. The professional challenge lies in moving beyond simply listing vulnerabilities to understanding their potential impact within a specific organizational context. This requires a nuanced approach that considers not just the technical severity of a vulnerability, but also its exploitability and the potential business impact if exploited. OSCP professionals are expected to provide actionable intelligence, not just raw data. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic process of correlating identified vulnerabilities with information from authoritative databases like the NVD and ExploitDB, and then assessing their potential impact. This aligns with best professional practices mandated by ethical hacking standards and the general principles of information security risk management. By cross-referencing CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures, from NVD with exploitability information from ExploitDB, a penetration tester can gauge the likelihood of a vulnerability being exploited in the wild. Subsequently, assessing the potential business impact, e.g., data breach, service disruption, financial loss, allows for effective prioritization of remediation efforts. This approach directly supports the principle of providing clients with a clear understanding of risks and actionable recommendations, which is a cornerstone of professional ethical conduct in cybersecurity. Incorrect approaches analysis, focusing solely on the CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, score from NVD without considering exploitability or business impact, is a common but flawed approach. While CVSS provides a standardized measure of severity, it doesn't account for the ease of exploitation or the specific context of the target environment. This can lead to misallocation of resources, where high severity but difficult to exploit vulnerabilities might be prioritized over lower severity but easily exploitable ones that pose a more immediate threat. This failure to conduct a comprehensive impact assessment can be seen as a professional failing, as it does not provide the client with the most effective risk mitigation strategy. Another incorrect approach is to only consider vulnerabilities for which public exploits are readily available on ExploitDB, ignoring vulnerabilities listed in NVD that might have zero-day exploits or exploits that are not yet publicly documented. This approach is too narrow and misses potential threats that sophisticated attackers might leverage. It also fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of vulnerability exploitation. Relying exclusively on vendor advisories without cross-referencing with NVD or ExploitDB is also problematic. Vendor advisories are valuable, but may not always provide the same level of detail regarding exploitability or independent severity scoring as NVD. This can lead to an incomplete understanding of the risk landscape. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a tiered approach to vulnerability impact assessment. First, identify all vulnerabilities and map them to their corresponding CVEs. Second, consult NVD for CVSS scores and general severity. Third, cross-reference with ExploitDB to understand exploit availability and maturity. Fourth, consider the business context of the affected systems to determine the potential impact of exploitation. This layered analysis allows for a more accurate and actionable risk assessment, enabling clients to make informed decisions about resource allocation for remediation. This process is crucial for maintaining professional integrity and delivering value to clients. Question 3. The evaluation methodology shows that during a penetration test focused on a specific web application, a critical vulnerability is identified in an adjacent but unscoped internal network service that is accessible from the tested application server. The tester has the technical capability to exploit this vulnerability to gain further access to the internal network. What is the most professional and ethically sound course of action? Option A. Immediately exploit the vulnerability to demonstrate the full extent of the risk to the client, as this is a critical security gap. Option B. Document the vulnerability thoroughly, including its potential impact and the method of discovery, and report it to the client's designated point of contact as a critical finding outside the original scope, recommending further investigation. Option C. Attempt to gain explicit written authorization to test the adjacent service before proceeding with any further actions, even documentation. Option D. Ignore the vulnerability as it falls outside the defined scope of the penetration test and is not directly related to the target application. The correct answer is B. Document the vulnerability thoroughly, including its potential impact and the method of discovery, and report it to the client's designated point of contact as a critical finding outside the original scope, recommending further investigation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the immediate desire to demonstrate a critical vulnerability and the ethical and regulatory obligation to follow a defined, authorized scope of work. The OSCP certification emphasizes a structured, methodical approach to penetration testing, mirroring real-world professional engagements. Rushing to exploit a vulnerability discovered outside the agreed-upon scope, even if technically feasible and seemingly beneficial, carries significant risks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it adheres strictly to the principles of authorized testing and responsible disclosure. By documenting the vulnerability and reporting it through the proper channels, the tester upholds the integrity of the engagement, respects the client's defined boundaries, and ensures that any remediation efforts are managed within the client's control. This aligns with the ethical guidelines of the cybersecurity profession, which prioritize client trust, legal compliance, and controlled risk management. The OSCP framework itself implicitly endorses this by focusing on demonstrating skills within a simulated, controlled environment that mirrors professional engagements with defined scopes. An incorrect approach of immediately exploiting the vulnerability outside the scope would be a significant ethical and professional failure. It constitutes unauthorized access, even if the intent is to highlight a risk. This action violates the trust placed in the penetration tester and could have legal ramifications for both the tester and the client. It bypasses established incident response and vulnerability management processes, potentially causing unintended disruption or data compromise. Furthermore, it demonstrates a lack of discipline and adherence to professional standards, which are core tenets of the OSCP certification. Another incorrect approach of ignoring the vulnerability, because it falls outside the scope, is also professionally deficient, though less severe than immediate exploitation. While technically adhering to the scope, it represents a missed opportunity for the client to address a critical security gap. Professional responsibility extends to identifying and reporting significant risks, even if they are discovered serendipitously, provided it can be done without violating the core engagement parameters or legal boundaries. The ethical failure here lies in a passive approach to risk identification when a clear and present danger is observed. The professional reasoning process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of the engagement scope of work, a commitment to ethical conduct, and a structured approach to vulnerability discovery and reporting. When an unexpected vulnerability is identified, the professional should first assess if its discovery or exploitation would inherently violate the scope or legal agreements. If not, the next step is to meticulously document the finding and report it to the designated point of contact within the client organization, adhering to any predefined disclosure policies. This ensures that the client is informed and can make decisions about addressing the vulnerability in a controlled manner. Question 4. The performance metrics show a significant increase in reported web application vulnerabilities, and you have been tasked with prioritizing remediation efforts. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional ethical standards and effective risk management in a penetration testing engagement? Option A. Focus only on vulnerabilities that are currently being actively exploited in the wild, as indicated by threat intelligence feeds, and defer others. Option B. Immediately deploy a generic security patch across all affected web applications without further investigation to address the reported vulnerabilities quickly. Option C. Share the raw vulnerability data with external security researchers to solicit their opinions on remediation strategies. Option D. Conduct a detailed root cause analysis for each reported vulnerability, assess its potential impact and exploitability, and then develop a prioritized remediation plan based on risk. The correct answer is D. Conduct a detailed root cause analysis for each reported vulnerability, assess its potential impact and exploitability, and then develop a prioritized remediation plan based on risk. Explanation. The performance metrics show a significant increase in reported web application vulnerabilities, indicating a potential rise in sophisticated attacks targeting the organization's online presence. This scenario is professionally challenging because it demands a rapid and accurate assessment of the threat landscape, balancing the urgency of remediation with the need for thorough, evidence-based decision-making. The OSCP certification emphasizes practical, hands-on skills in penetration testing, and this question tests the ability to apply those skills within a realistic operational context, adhering strictly to the ethical and legal boundaries defined by the exam's jurisdiction. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, evidence-driven methodology aligned with industry standards and the ethical principles expected of a certified professional. This involves a detailed analysis of the vulnerabilities, understanding their potential impact, and then formulating a remediation strategy based on risk. This aligns with the core tenets of ethical hacking and penetration testing, which require responsible disclosure, accurate reporting, and a focus on improving security posture rather than simply identifying flaws. The OSCP framework implicitly mandates adherence to ethical guidelines and professional conduct, ensuring that actions taken are both effective and legally sound within the specified jurisdiction. An incorrect approach that involves immediately deploying a broad, unverified patch without understanding the specific root cause of each vulnerability is professionally unacceptable. This fails to demonstrate a deep understanding of the attack vectors and could introduce new security flaws or disrupt legitimate application functionality, leading to business impact. Ethically, it represents a failure to conduct a thorough assessment and a disregard for the principle of least privilege and targeted remediation. From a regulatory perspective within the OSCP context, this could be seen as negligence, failing to exercise due diligence in protecting the client's assets. Another incorrect approach, such as ignoring the reported vulnerabilities due to a perceived lack of immediate impact, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a failure to proactively manage risk and a disregard for potential future exploitation. Ethically, it violates the duty of care expected of a security professional. Regulatory frameworks, even those implied by the OSCP, would likely view this as a dereliction of duty, potentially leading to severe consequences if a breach occurs. Finally, an approach that involves sharing detailed vulnerability information with unauthorized parties before proper disclosure and remediation is a severe ethical and potentially legal breach. This violates confidentiality agreements and could expose the organization to further attacks. Such an action would be a direct contravention of the ethical standards expected of any cybersecurity professional, especially one holding a certification like OSCP, and would have significant legal ramifications within any jurisdiction. The professional reasoning process should involve 1. Understanding the scope and context of the reported vulnerabilities. 2. Prioritizing vulnerabilities based on their potential impact and exploitability. 3. Conducting detailed technical analysis to identify root causes. 4. Developing targeted remediation strategies. 5. Documenting findings and recommendations clearly and concisely. 6. Communicating findings and remediation plans to relevant stakeholders in a secure and timely manner. This structured approach ensures that security efforts are effective, efficient, and ethically sound. Question 5. Strategic planning requires a security professional to adapt a publicly available exploit for a specific, hardened enterprise network. The professional has identified a potential vulnerability in a legacy application running on the target network. Considering the OSCP exam's focus on exploit development and modification, which of the following approaches best demonstrates a sound and ethical methodology for adapting the exploit? Option A. Directly applying the exploit code to the target system after making minor adjustments to network-related parameters, assuming the core exploit logic will remain effective. Option B. Thoroughly analyzing the original exploit's code to understand its buffer overflow, heap spray, or shellcode execution mechanisms. then meticulously modifying it to account for the target system's specific architecture, memory layout, and any implemented security mitigations, followed by stage testing in an isolated lab environment. Option C. Recompiling the exploit with default settings and attempting to run it against the target, relying on the compiler's optimizations to adapt it to the new environment. Option D. Searching for a different, prepackaged exploit that is advertised as being compatible with the identified legacy application, without further investigation into its origin or functionality. The correct answer is A. Directly applying the exploit code to the target system after making minor adjustments to network-related parameters, assuming the core exploit logic will remain effective. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in exploit development, adapting existing code for a new target environment. The professional difficulty lies in accurately assessing the impact of modifications without introducing new vulnerabilities or causing system instability. This requires a deep understanding of the exploit's mechanics, the target system's architecture, and the potential side effects of code changes. Careful judgment is paramount to ensure the exploit remains effective while adhering to ethical and legal boundaries. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic and controlled process. By thoroughly analyzing the original exploit, understanding the target system specifics, and performing incremental testing in a controlled environment, a security professional minimizes risks. This methodical approach aligns with the principles of responsible disclosure and ethical hacking, ensuring that any developed tools are used for legitimate security testing and not for malicious purposes. The focus on understanding the underlying mechanisms rather than blindly copying and pasting code is crucial for developing robust and reliable security solutions. An incorrect approach that involves directly applying an exploit without understanding its internal workings or the target environment specifics is professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for potential unintended consequences. Such an approach could lead to system crashes, data corruption, or the introduction of new security flaws, all of which are detrimental to the integrity of the target system and the reputation of the security professional. Furthermore, using an exploit without proper authorization or understanding its full implications could violate ethical guidelines and potentially legal statutes related to unauthorized access or system interference. Another incorrect approach, such as modifying an exploit solely based on superficial similarities between the original and target systems, is also professionally unsound. This overlooks critical architectural differences and security configurations that could render the modified exploit ineffective or, worse, dangerous. It reflects a superficial understanding and a failure to engage in the deep analysis required for effective exploit development. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a phased approach: initial research and understanding of the exploit and target, controlled experimentation and modification, rigorous testing in isolated environments, and thorough documentation of all changes and their observed effects. This iterative process, grounded in technical understanding and ethical consideration, ensures that security professionals can effectively develop and adapt exploit code responsibly. Question 6. Stakeholder feedback indicates that several network services on the internal corporate network are potentially vulnerable to exploitation. As an offensive security professional tasked with improving the organization's security posture, you have identified specific network services and protocols that could be compromised. Before proceeding with any active exploitation, attempts to demonstrate the impact of these vulnerabilities. What is the most professionally responsible and ethically sound course of action? Option A. Report the vulnerabilities to the IT help desk and await their instructions on how to proceed. Option B. Document the identified vulnerabilities and their potential impact, then formally request authorization and define a clear scope for penetration testing activities with the relevant stakeholders before proceeding. Option C. Advise the organization to immediately shut down all network services until a comprehensive security audit can be completed. Option D. Immediately initiate exploitation attempts on the identified vulnerable services to demonstrate the severity of the risks to management. Correct answer is D. Immediately initiate exploitation attempts on the identified vulnerable services to demonstrate the severity of the risks to management. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for network security improvements with the potential for disruption and the need for clear communication and authorization. The OSCP certification emphasizes practical, hands-on exploitation and penetration testing, which inherently involves interacting with live systems. However, responsible security professionals must operate within defined scopes and obtain explicit permission before conducting any intrusive testing. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, risk-aware methodology. This involves understanding the potential impact of exploitation, attempts on critical business functions, and ensuring that any testing is performed with the explicit consent and knowledge of the asset owners. This aligns with ethical hacking principles and the implicit understanding within the cybersecurity community that unauthorized access or disruption is illegal and unethical. Specifically, it reflects the need for a formal engagement process, scope definition, and risk assessment before commencing any penetration testing activities, which are fundamental to professional conduct in offensive security. An incorrect approach that involves immediately attempting to exploit identified vulnerabilities without prior authorization or risk assessment is professionally unacceptable. This constitutes unauthorized access, which is illegal and unethical, violating principles of responsible disclosure, and potentially causing significant damage to the organization's operations and reputation. Such actions could lead to severe legal repercussions for the individual and the organization, and would undoubtedly result in disciplinary action, including potential revocation of certifications. Another incorrect approach, which is to report vulnerabilities to a generic security contact without a defined process for handling such disclosures, fails to ensure timely and effective remediation. While reporting is a positive step, the lack of a structured process can lead to the vulnerability being overlooked or deprioritized, thus leaving the network exposed. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of incident response and vulnerability management best practices. A further incorrect approach, which is to delay any action until a formal penetration test is scheduled, ignores the immediate risk posed by the identified vulnerabilities. While formal testing is valuable, proactive measures to address critical findings, even before a full engagement, are often necessary to mitigate immediate threats. This approach prioritizes process over immediate risk reduction. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the engagement scope and authorization. 2. Performing a thorough risk assessment of identified vulnerabilities, considering their potential impact and exploitability. 3. Communicating findings and proposed actions to relevant stakeholders. 4. Obtaining explicit approval for any intrusive testing or remediation activities. 5. Documenting all actions taken and their outcomes. Question 7. Benchmark analysis indicates that a recent network scan of a client's internal network has returned a large volume of potential vulnerabilities. The scan report lists numerous entries, including outdated software versions, missing patches, and several services running with default configurations. The penetration tester is tasked with analyzing these results to provide a prioritized list of actionable findings for the client. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of professional penetration testing and the objectives of demonstrating practical exploitability? Option A. Focus on identifying and verifying vulnerabilities that are demonstrably exploitable within the current network environment, prioritizing those with the highest potential impact on critical assets, and documenting the exploitation process. Option B. Rely exclusively on the automated vulnerability scanner's output, assuming all reported issues are critical and require immediate attention without further manual verification. Option C. Report all identified vulnerabilities directly from the scan results, emphasizing the sheer number of issues to highlight the extensive security posture weaknesses. Option D. Prioritize vulnerabilities based solely on the CVSS scores provided by the scanning tool, regardless of whether they can be practically exploited in the client's specific setup. Correct answer is A. Focus on identifying and verifying vulnerabilities that are demonstrably exploitable within the current network environment, prioritizing those with the highest potential impact on critical assets, and documenting the exploitation process. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, interpreting raw scan data to identify actionable vulnerabilities. Professional difficulty lies in distinguishing genuine threats from noise, prioritizing effectively, and ensuring that the findings are presented in a manner that aligns with ethical hacking principles, and the OSCP focus on practical, real-world exploitation. The OSCP exam emphasizes demonstrating a thorough understanding of the attack lifecycle, including reconnaissance, vulnerability identification, exploitation, and post-exploitation. Misinterpreting scan results can lead to wasted effort, inaccurate reporting, and potentially overlooking critical vulnerabilities. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a systematic and critical evaluation of the scan data. It prioritizes vulnerabilities based on a combination of technical severity, e.g., CVSS score, and exploitability within the context of the target environment. This aligns with the OSCP objective of simulating real-world attack scenarios where resources are limited and attackers focus on the most impactful targets. Ethical considerations are paramount. Reporting only confirmed, exploitable vulnerabilities ensures that the client receives accurate and actionable intelligence, avoiding unnecessary alarm or misdirection. This methodical process demonstrates a mature understanding of risk assessment and reporting, which are core competencies for a certified penetration tester. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the number of vulnerabilities reported without verification is professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of critical analysis and a failure to distinguish between potential issues and actual security weaknesses. Ethically, it can lead to a client being overwhelmed with false positives, wasting their resources on non-existent problems, and potentially eroding trust in the penetration testing process. It also fails to meet the OSCP standard of demonstrating practical exploitation skills. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes vulnerabilities based solely on the vendor's stated severity without considering exploitability is also flawed. While vendor severity is a useful starting point, it doesn't always reflect the ease with which a vulnerability can be exploited in a specific environment. A high-severity vulnerability that requires complex prerequisites or is difficult to exploit might be less critical in practice than a medium-severity vulnerability that is easily exploitable. This approach can lead to misallocation of remediation efforts. Finally, an approach that relies entirely on automated tools to identify and report vulnerabilities without manual verification is a significant professional and ethical failure. Automated tools are valuable for initial discovery, but are prone to false positives and can miss nuanced vulnerabilities that require human expertise to identify. Reporting unverified findings as exploitable can have serious consequences for the client and undermines the credibility of the penetration tester. The OSCP exam requires candidates to go beyond mere tool output and demonstrate a deeper understanding of how vulnerabilities work and how they can be exploited. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the scope and objectives of the engagement. 2. Thoroughly reviewing all scan results, cross-referencing with other sources if possible. 3. Manually verifying potential vulnerabilities through targeted testing and exploitation attempts. 4. Assessing the exploitability of confirmed vulnerabilities within the target environment. 5. Prioritizing vulnerabilities based on a combination of severity, exploitability, and potential business impact. 6. Clearly documenting findings, including evidence of exploitation, and providing actionable recommendations. Question 8. Risk assessment procedures indicate a need to identify the wireless network landscape within a client's perimeter. Which of the following approaches best aligns with ethical and effective wireless reconnaissance practices for an OSCP-certified professional? Option A. Physically inspecting the premises for visible wireless access points and noting their physical locations. Option B. Actively attempting to deauthenticate wireless clients to force them to reconnect and reveal network information. Option C. Using network intrusion detection systems to scan for and identify wireless network traffic patterns. Option D. Employing passive Wi-Fi scanning tools to identify available SSIDs, analyze signal strengths, and detect the presence of access points without direct interaction. The correct answer is D. Employing passive Wi-Fi scanning tools to identify available SSIDs, analyze signal strengths, and detect the presence of access points without direct interaction. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, effectively and ethically gathering intelligence on wireless infrastructure without causing disruption or violating privacy. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive reconnaissance with the legal and ethical boundaries of the engagement. OSCP certification emphasizes practical skills within a defined ethical and legal framework, meaning any action taken must be justifiable and within the scope of authorized testing. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes non-intrusive methods that provide actionable intelligence without impacting network availability or user experience. This aligns with the OSCP emphasis on ethical hacking and responsible disclosure. Specifically, using passive techniques like Wi-Fi scanning tools to identify SSIDs, signal strengths, and potentially hidden networks is a standard, low-impact reconnaissance method. Analyzing this data allows for an understanding of the wireless landscape, identifying potential targets for further, authorized testing. This method respects the client's infrastructure and users, adhering to the principle of do no harm, unless explicitly authorized for specific intrusive tests. An incorrect approach that involves actively probing or attempting to deauthenticate clients is ethically and regulatorily unsound. Such actions can disrupt legitimate wireless communications, leading to denial of service conditions for users, and potentially violating laws against unauthorized access or interference with electronic communication. This directly contravenes the ethical guidelines expected of a certified professional and could lead to legal repercussions for both the tester and the client. Another incorrect approach, such as solely relying on visual inspection of access points without any technical scanning, is insufficient for thorough reconnaissance. While it might identify physical devices, it fails to provide critical information about network configurations, signal propagation, or the presence of unauthorized access points, thus not meeting the objectives of a comprehensive risk assessment. Professionals should approach wireless reconnaissance by first understanding the authorized scope of the engagement. They should then employ passive techniques to gather as much information as possible without interacting with the target network in a way that could cause disruption. This includes identifying all visible SSIDs, noting signal strengths, and looking for common configurations or potential vulnerabilities based on observed network names. Any further steps, especially those involving active probing or exploitation, must be explicitly authorized and conducted with extreme caution, always prioritizing the integrity and availability of the client systems. Question 9. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of unusual outbound traffic originating from a web application, specifically requests containing encoded JavaScript payloads targeting user session cookies. As an OSCP candidate tasked with assessing this application, which of the following actions best demonstrates a professional and ethical approach to understanding and exploiting this potential cross-site scripting XSS vulnerability within the exam's regulatory framework? Option A. Injecting a JavaScript payload that redirects the user to an external malicious website to harvest their credentials. Option B. Modifying the application's source code to remove the vulnerability without documenting the exploit or the remediation steps. Option C. Crafting a non-destructive JavaScript payload that alerts with a unique identifier proving the script execution and the presence of the target cookie, without exfiltrating the cookie's value or attempting further system compromise. Option D. Attempting to exfiltrate the full session cookie value, and then using it to hijack a user's session to gain administrative privileges. The correct answer is C. Crafting a non-destructive JavaScript payload that alerts with a unique identifier proving the script execution and the presence of the target cookie, without exfiltrating the cookie's value or attempting further system compromise. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of unusual outbound traffic originating from a web application, specifically requests containing encoded JavaScript payloads targeting user session cookies. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a security professional to not only identify a potential cross-site scripting (XSS) vulnerability, but also to understand the implications of its exploitation and the appropriate response within the OSCP exam's strict regulatory and ethical framework. The challenge lies in balancing the need to demonstrate exploitation techniques with the imperative to act responsibly and within the defined scope of the examination. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it focuses on controlled, ethical exploitation and thorough documentation, aligning with the OSCP emphasis on practical, hands-on skills within a simulated, authorized environment. This involves crafting a non-destructive payload that clearly proves the vulnerability without causing harm or exfiltrating sensitive data, beyond what is necessary to demonstrate the exploit. The ethical justification stems from the principle of authorized penetration testing, where the objective is to identify and report vulnerabilities to improve security, not to cause damage or gain unauthorized access to real-world systems. This aligns with the ethical guidelines expected of cybersecurity professionals, particularly in a certification context where adherence to rules of engagement is paramount. An incorrect approach involving the exfiltration of sensitive user data, such as full session cookies or personal identifiable information, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would violate the OSCP explicit rules against unauthorized data access and would be considered a breach of professional conduct. Such an action could be construed as malicious intent, even within a simulated environment, and would undermine the integrity of the examination and the certification itself. Furthermore, attempting to exploit the vulnerability to gain administrative access or pivot to other systems without explicit authorization within the exam scope would also constitute a serious ethical and regulatory violation, as it exceeds the defined boundaries of the penetration test. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the authorized scope of engagement, the specific objectives of the penetration test, and the ethical guidelines governing cybersecurity professionals. Before attempting any exploitation, a professional should ask, what is the minimum required to prove this vulnerability? And what are the potential consequences of my actions, even in a simulated environment? The decision-making process should prioritize demonstrating technical proficiency in a controlled, ethical, and non-disruptive manner, always adhering to the established rules of engagement and the principles of responsible disclosure. Question 10. The audit findings indicate that the web application generates session tokens using a predictable algorithm, making them susceptible to enumeration and hijacking. As an OSCP candidate, your task is to demonstrate the exploitability of this session management vulnerability. Which of the following approaches most effectively simulates a real-world attack scenario and proves the severity of the flaw within the exam scope? Option A. Develop a script to systematically generate a sequence of likely session tokens based on the observed algorithm and attempt to authenticate as other users by injecting these tokens. Option B. Initiate a brute force attack against the login page, attempting to guess common username and password combinations to gain access to active sessions. Option C. Focus on finding and exploiting a separate SQL injection vulnerability on a different page of the application, as this is a common web application flaw. Option D. Report the predictable session token generation to the proctor without attempting to exploit it, citing the audit findings as sufficient evidence of the vulnerability. The correct answer is A. Develop a script to systematically generate a sequence of likely session tokens based on the observed algorithm and attempt to authenticate as other users by injecting these tokens. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a critical vulnerability in the application's session management, specifically the predictable generation of session tokens. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the penetration tester to not only identify the technical flaw, but also to understand its potential impact within the OSCP exam's defined regulatory and ethical framework. The challenge lies in demonstrating a comprehensive understanding of how session hijacking can occur and the implications of such an exploit, all while adhering strictly to the exam's rules of engagement and ethical hacking principles. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the identified vulnerability by attempting to exploit it in a controlled and ethical manner, simulating a real-world attack scenario. This involves crafting a method to predict or manipulate session tokens to gain unauthorized access. This aligns with the OSCP emphasis on practical, hands-on exploitation and demonstrating the ability to identify and leverage security weaknesses. The ethical justification stems from the exam's mandate to simulate offensive security operations within a defined scope, thereby proving competency in identifying and mitigating such risks. An incorrect approach that involves brute forcing session tokens without a clear understanding of the generation algorithm, or attempting to exploit other unrelated vulnerabilities would be professionally unacceptable. This is because it deviates from the specific findings of the audit and wastes valuable time and resources on less impactful or irrelevant attack vectors. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of focus and an inability to prioritize remediation efforts based on concrete evidence. Another incorrect approach, such as simply reporting the vulnerability without attempting to demonstrate its exploitability, fails to meet the practical demonstration requirements of the OSCP, which emphasizes hands-on proof of concept. This would be a failure to provide actionable intelligence to the client, the exam environment, and would not showcase the required skill set. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the root cause of the vulnerability, assessing its potential impact, and then devising a targeted exploitation strategy. This involves a methodical approach. First, analyze the session token generation mechanism. Second, identify weaknesses in that mechanism, e.g., predictability, insufficient entropy. Third, develop an exploit that leverages these weaknesses. And finally, document the exploit and its implications thoroughly. This structured approach ensures that efforts are focused, efficient, and directly address the security concerns raised by the audit. Question 11. Governance review demonstrates that a penetration testing engagement has been authorized for a specific network segment. The primary objective of the initial phase is to identify active services and protocols running on target hosts without causing any disruption or triggering intrusion detection systems. Which of the following network scanning tools, when employed with the most appropriate configuration for this objective, best aligns with the ethical and professional conduct expected during such an engagement? Option A. Nmap utilizing aggressive scan types like SYN or UDP scans. Option B. Wireshark configured for passive listening on the network segment. Option C. TCP dump configured to capture all network traffic without specific filters. Option D. Nessus or OpenVAS with default vulnerability scan profiles. The correct answer is B. Wireshark configured for passive listening on the network segment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing and security auditing, balancing the need for comprehensive network reconnaissance with the potential for disruptive or unauthorized activity. The OSCP exam emphasizes ethical hacking and adherence to scope. Misinterpreting the scope or employing overly aggressive scanning techniques can lead to unintended consequences, such as service outages, detection by intrusion detection systems, or exceeding authorized access, all of which carry significant professional and ethical ramifications. The challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate tool and methodology that aligns with the defined objectives and constraints of the engagement. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves selecting a tool that provides granular control over network traffic and allows for deep packet inspection without necessarily initiating intrusive or potentially disruptive probes. Wireshark, when used in passive listening mode, fits this requirement perfectly. It allows for the observation of network traffic without actively sending packets that could alter the state of network devices or services. This aligns with the OSCP emphasis on ethical reconnaissance and staying within the bounds of authorized activity. By passively observing traffic, an OSCP candidate can identify running services, protocols, and potential vulnerabilities without directly interacting with them, thus minimizing risk and adhering to the principle of least privilege in reconnaissance. This approach is ethically sound as it avoids unauthorized probing and aligns with the professional standard of conducting security assessments responsibly. Incorrect approach is analysis. Employing Nmap with aggressive scan flags, e.g., SYN scan, ACK scan, or UDP scan without proper consideration for target sensitivity can be overly intrusive. While Nmap is a powerful tool for network discovery, its active probing can trigger security alerts, disrupt services, or even cause instability on vulnerable systems. This constitutes a regulatory and ethical failure by potentially exceeding the authorized scope of the assessment and causing harm to the target environment, which is contrary to the principles of ethical hacking and professional conduct expected in a penetration testing engagement. Utilizing Nessus or OpenVAS without a clear understanding of their default scan profiles and potential impact is also problematic. These vulnerability scanners are designed to actively probe systems for known vulnerabilities, which can be resource-intensive and potentially disruptive. If not configured carefully, or if run against systems not explicitly included in the scope, they can lead to service degradation or denial of service. This represents a failure to exercise due diligence and professional judgment, potentially violating the terms of engagement and ethical guidelines by causing unintended damage. Using TCP dump without a specific filtering strategy can generate an overwhelming amount of data, making it difficult to extract meaningful information. While TCP dump is a powerful packet capture tool, its primary function is capture, not analysis. Without a clear objective and appropriate filters, it can lead to inefficient use of resources and a failure to achieve the desired reconnaissance goals within the allocated time, indirectly leading to a less effective and potentially less ethical assessment by not maximizing the value of the authorized access. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the engagement scope, assessing the potential impact of each tool and technique, and selecting the least intrusive method that achieves the objective. This involves a risk-based approach, where the potential benefits of a particular scanning method are weighed against the potential risks to the target environment. For network reconnaissance, passive observation tools like Wireshark are often the most appropriate starting point, especially when dealing with sensitive environments or when the scope is not fully defined. If active scanning is required, it should be performed with carefully chosen flags and profiles, with explicit authorization and a clear understanding of the potential consequences. Question 12. Upon reviewing the initial findings of a web application penetration test, you have identified the robots .txt file and observed that it disallows crawling of certain directories. You have also noted the presence of common web server headers and a few JavaScript files. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the ethical and regulatory framework of the OSCP for continuing web application reconnaissance? Option A. Immediately attempt to bypass the robots. TXT disallow directives to explore the restricted directories, as this is a common technique for uncovering hidden content. Option B. Focus solely on identifying the web server version and attempt to exploit known vulnerabilities in that specific version without further reconnaissance of the application structure. Option C. Proceed with spidering the website using authorized tools, analyzing the robots .txt file for insights into the server's intended structure, and passively identifying web technologies by examining HTTP headers and publicly available information, while respecting the disallowed directives in robots .txt. Option D. Initiate aggressive brute force attacks against common administrative login pages and sensitive file paths that are not explicitly mentioned in the scope, assuming they are likely targets. The correct answer is C. Proceed with spidering the website using authorized tools, analyzing the robots .txt file for insights into the server's intended structure, and passively identifying web technologies by examining HTTP headers and publicly available information, while respecting the disallowed directives in robots .txt. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in web application penetration testing, balancing thorough reconnaissance with the ethical and legal boundaries of engagement. The professional is tasked with gathering critical information about a target web application's technology stack and structure, which is essential for identifying potential vulnerabilities. However, the method of information gathering must strictly adhere to the defined scope of the penetration test and the ethical guidelines governing the offensive security Certified Professional OSCP certification. The challenge lies in distinguishing between legitimate, authorized reconnaissance activities and those that could be construed as unauthorized access or misuse of information, even if no direct harm is caused. The OSCP framework emphasizes a responsible and ethical approach to security testing, where understanding and respecting the scope and limitations are paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves utilizing publicly available information and authorized tools within the agreed-upon scope of the penetration test. This includes analyzing the robots .txt file, which is a standard and ethical method for understanding a web server's intended crawling behavior, spidering the website using authorized tools, identifying web technologies through passive and active techniques, like banner grabbing or analyzing HTTP headers, and enumerating directories and files that are intentionally exposed or accessible through standard browsing are all legitimate reconnaissance activities. These actions are permissible because they are designed to understand the application's structure and technologies without attempting to bypass security controls or access unauthorized areas. The OSCP certification emphasizes mastering these foundational techniques as part of a responsible penetration testing methodology. Adhering to these practices ensures that the testing remains within legal and ethical boundaries, respecting the client's infrastructure and data. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves attempting to access or exploit vulnerabilities in the web server's configuration or underlying infrastructure that are not explicitly included in the scope of the penetration test. This could include trying to bypass robots, TXT directives to access disallowed directories, or attempting to exploit known vulnerabilities in the web server software without prior authorization. Such actions cross the line from reconnaissance into unauthorized access or attempted exploitation, violating the ethical principles of penetration testing and potentially the terms of the OSCP engagement. Another incorrect approach might involve using automated tools to perform aggressive vulnerability scanning or brute force attacks against sensitive areas of the application without explicit permission. While these techniques can be part of a penetration test, their application must be carefully controlled and scoped to avoid causing disruption or being perceived as malicious activity. The OSCP curriculum stresses the importance of controlled and authorized actions, and any deviation from the agreed-upon scope, even if seemingly minor, can lead to ethical and legal repercussions. Professional reasoning. Professionals must adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes understanding and adhering to the scope of engagement. Before initiating any reconnaissance activity, a thorough review of the penetration test agreement, including the defined scope, rules of engagement, and any specific restrictions, is essential. This includes understanding what types of tools and techniques are permitted and what actions are explicitly forbidden. When in doubt about the permissibility of a particular reconnaissance technique, it is always best to seek clarification from the client or the engagement manager. The OSCP certification instills a mindset of ethical hacking, where the goal is to identify vulnerabilities responsibly and report them, not to cause harm or unauthorized access. Therefore, the professional decision-making process should always involve a risk assessment of the proposed action against the established ethical and legal framework of the engagement. Question 13. Strategic planning requires a penetration tester to demonstrate the impact of client-side vulnerabilities within a web application. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional ethical standards and the practical requirements of a penetration test, while minimizing risk to the client's live environment? Option A. Research and document theoretical client-side vulnerabilities that could affect the client's application, without attempting any practical exploitation due to the potential for system instability. Option B. Create a dedicated, isolated testing environment that mirrors the client's production web application, and then develop and execute client-side exploits against this test instance to demonstrate vulnerability impact. Option C. Develop and deploy a proof-of-concept exploit targeting a specific, unpatched version of a common web browser that the client's users might have installed, aiming to demonstrate a potential attack vector. Option D. Craft a malicious payload designed to exploit a client-side vulnerability, and then attempt to deliver it to the client's production web server to trigger the exploit in a live user's browser. The correct answer is C. Develop and deploy a proof-of-concept exploit targeting a specific, unpatched version of a common web browser that the client's users might have installed, aiming to demonstrate a potential attack vector. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent risks associated with client-side exploitation. The primary difficulty lies in balancing the need to demonstrate vulnerability to a client with the ethical and legal imperative to avoid causing harm or unauthorized access. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any testing is conducted within the agreed-upon scope and with explicit consent, minimizing the potential for unintended consequences. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a controlled and authorized environment for testing. This involves simulating real-world attack vectors against a dedicated, isolated test instance of the client's web application. This method allows for the thorough identification and exploitation of client-side vulnerabilities, such as cross-site scripting XSS or insecure direct object references, IDOR, within the browser context, without impacting the live production system or its users. This adheres to the principle of least privilege and ensures that all actions are documented and auditable, aligning with professional ethical standards and the implicit requirement for responsible disclosure and testing within the OSCP framework. An incorrect approach that involves directly targeting the client's production web server with a crafted malicious payload, even with the intention of demonstrating a client-side vulnerability, is professionally unacceptable. This constitutes unauthorized access and potential disruption of services, violating ethical guidelines and potentially legal statutes related to computer misuse. The risk of collateral damage, data corruption, or system downtime is unacceptably high. Another incorrect approach, attempting to exploit a vulnerability in a common third-party client-side application, like a specific browser version or plugin, that the client might be using, is also problematic. While this reflects a real-world threat, it moves beyond the agreed-upon scope of testing the client's specific application. It introduces an uncontrolled variable and could lead to unintended consequences on systems not under the tester's purview, raising significant ethical and legal concerns. A further incorrect approach, focusing solely on theoretical client-side vulnerabilities without practical demonstration on a test environment, fails to meet the practical requirements of a penetration test. While understanding theory is crucial, the OSCP certification emphasizes hands-on exploitation. Without a controlled demonstration, the client cannot fully grasp the severity or the practical implications of the identified weaknesses. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the engagement scope, explicit client authorization for all testing activities, and a commitment to using dedicated, isolated test environments. Prioritizing the safety and integrity of the client's production systems is paramount. When in doubt, always seek clarification from the client and err on the side of caution. The goal is to provide actionable intelligence, not to cause harm or disruption. Question 14. The efficiency study reveals that a simulated client network requires a comprehensive yet stealthy active reconnaissance phase to identify potential attack vectors. Given the constraints of the OSCP exam environment, which mandates adherence to specific, non-intrusive methodologies, what is the most effective and compliant approach to gather initial intelligence on open ports, running services, and operating systems? Option A. Prioritize vulnerability scanning on every single discovered port across all hosts, regardless of service identification, and then perform a basic TCP ping sweep to identify live hosts. Option B. Execute a full TCP connect scan on all discovered hosts to identify open ports, followed by an OS fingerprinting attempt on every host, and then perform a UDP scan on a limited range of ports known to host web services. Option C. Initiate a broad TCP/SYN scan across all subnets to identify live hosts and open ports, followed by service version detection and OS fingerprinting on all identified open ports. Subsequently, perform targeted UDP scans on common service ports, e.g., DNS, SNMP, Kerberos, and then conduct vulnerability scans on services identified as potentially vulnerable. Option D. Conduct an aggressive UDP scan of all 65,535 ports on every discovered host to maximize the discovery of all running services, followed by a comprehensive TCP/SYN scan, and then attempt OS fingerprinting on all hosts. Correct answer is C. Initiate a broad TCP/SYN scan across all subnets to identify live hosts and open ports, followed by service version detection and OS fingerprinting on all identified open ports. Subsequently, perform targeted UDP scans on common service ports, e.g., DNS, SNMP, Kerberos, and then conduct vulnerability scans on services identified as potentially vulnerable. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a critical need to optimize network reconnaissance for a simulated client environment, adhering strictly to offensive security certified professional OSCP exam guidelines. This scenario is professionally challenging because it demands a precise balance between thoroughness and adherence to the simulated client's network policy, which, for the purpose of this exam, is implicitly defined by the OSCP exam rules. These rules mandate that all actions taken during the exam must be within the scope of the provided lab environment and must not impact other participants or the integrity of the exam infrastructure. The core challenge lies in gathering sufficient intelligence for exploitation without crossing ethical or technical boundaries that would lead to disqualification. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes stealth, efficiency, and the gathering of actionable intelligence through legitimate, non-intrusive means within the defined scope. This aligns with the OSCP emphasis on demonstrating practical skills in a controlled, ethical manner. Specifically, employing targeted TCP/SYN scans, SS, for initial port discovery, followed by service version detection, SV, and OS fingerprinting, O, on identified open ports, provides a comprehensive yet relatively quiet initial footprint. UDP scanning, SU, is then selectively applied to common UDP ports known to host critical services, acknowledging its slower nature and higher potential for detection. Banner grabbing is implicitly part of service version detection. Network mapping is achieved through the cumulative understanding gained from these scans, identifying host relationships and potential attack vectors. This method minimizes the attack surface presented to intrusion detection systems, while maximizing the intelligence gathered for subsequent exploitation phases, directly reflecting the OSCP objective of simulating real-world penetration testing methodologies. An incorrect approach that involves aggressive, broad-spectrum UDP scanning of all 65,535 ports without prior justification or targeting of known UDP services is professionally unacceptable. While it might uncover more services, its indiscriminate nature significantly increases the likelihood of triggering network alerts and consuming excessive network resources, which is contrary to the OSCP emphasis on efficient and targeted reconnaissance. This approach demonstrates a lack of strategic thinking and disregard for the potential impact on the target environment, a critical failure in professional penetration testing. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes vulnerability scanning, SV, on every single discovered port, including those with no identifiable service or those known to be benign, is also professionally flawed. This is inefficient and can lead to a flood of false positives or irrelevant information, obscuring critical findings. It also increases the time spent on reconnaissance, potentially alerting defenders. In a real-world scenario, this would be a waste of resources and could compromise the stealth required for a successful engagement. For the OSCP, it indicates a misunderstanding of prioritizing actionable intelligence. A third incorrect approach that involves attempting to fingerprint the operating system on every single host discovered, regardless of whether it has open ports or running services, is also a misapplication of resources. OS fingerprinting is most effective and relevant when applied to hosts with active services that can be queried. Performing it indiscriminately is a waste of time and network bandwidth, and it does not contribute meaningfully to the primary objective of identifying exploitable vulnerabilities. This demonstrates a lack of focus and an inefficient use of scanning tools, which is contrary to the OSCP emphasis on practical, efficient skill demonstration. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a phased approach to reconnaissance. Begin with broad, low-impact scans to identify live hosts and open TCP ports. Then, refine the scan by performing service and OS detection on these identified ports. Subsequently, conduct targeted UDP scans on ports known to host critical services. Only after establishing a solid understanding of the network topology and running services should vulnerability scanning be applied to specific, high-value targets or services. This iterative and targeted methodology ensures efficiency, stealth, and the collection of the most relevant intelligence for the penetration testing engagement, mirroring the expectations of the OSCP exam. Question 15. Assessment of a penetration tester's methodology when tasked with identifying and demonstrating the exploitability of vulnerabilities within a client's network, using the Metasploit framework and other exploit databases. The tester has identified a potential vulnerability on a target system. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional ethical and legal standards for penetration testing? Option A. Search Metasploit's module database for exploits targeting the identified vulnerability, review the exploit's description and known payloads, and select a stable exploit with a low risk of system instability before attempting to execute it against the target. Option B. Utilize a generic exploit from Metasploit that is known to be aggressive, assuming it will provide a quick demonstration of exploitability, regardless of the specific vulnerability or system configuration. Option C. Attempt to exploit the vulnerability using a publicly available script found on a general-purpose code repository, without confirming its origin, reliability, or specific application to the target environment. Option D. Immediately download and execute the first exploit found on ExploitDB that claims to target the identified vulnerability, without verifying its compatibility or potential impact. The correct answer is A. Search Metasploit's module database for exploits targeting the identified vulnerability, review the exploit's description and known payloads, and select a stable exploit with a low risk of system instability before attempting to execute it against the target. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing: the need to leverage powerful exploit frameworks like Metasploit while adhering to strict ethical and legal boundaries. The professional challenge lies in balancing the offensive capabilities of these tools with the defensive responsibilities of a security professional, ensuring that actions remain within the scope of authorized testing and do not inadvertently cause harm or violate privacy. Careful judgment is required to select appropriate exploits, understand their potential impact, and ensure proper documentation and reporting. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes authorized access and controlled exploitation, utilizing Metasploit search functionality to identify vulnerabilities relevant to the target environment, followed by careful selection of an exploit that is known to be stable and has a low risk of causing system instability or data corruption, demonstrates a methodical and responsible use of the framework. This aligns with the OSCP emphasis on ethical hacking, where the goal is to identify and report vulnerabilities without causing damage. The process of verifying the exploit's applicability and understanding its payload ensures that the testing remains focused and controlled, minimizing unintended consequences. This methodical approach is crucial for maintaining trust with the client and adhering to the principles of responsible disclosure. An incorrect approach that involves indiscriminately running exploits from ExploitDB without prior research or verification is professionally unacceptable. This action constitutes a significant ethical and potentially legal failure. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the potential impact on the target system. Such behavior could lead to system crashes, data loss, or denial of service, which are not only detrimental to the client, but also violate the core principles of ethical hacking. Furthermore, using exploits without understanding their mechanisms or potential side effects can lead to misinterpretation of results and an inability to provide accurate remediation advice. Another incorrect approach, which involves using a publicly available exploit without confirming its relevance to the specific version and configuration of the target system, is also professionally unsound. This can lead to wasted effort, false positives, or even unintended system compromise that is difficult to trace back or remediate. It shows a lack of technical rigor and a failure to apply the principles of targeted exploitation. The professional reasoning framework for such situations involves a multi-step process. First, clearly define the scope of the engagement and obtain explicit authorization for all testing activities. Second, conduct thorough reconnaissance to understand the target environment and identify potential vulnerabilities. Third, research and select appropriate tools and exploits, prioritizing those with a proven track record and a low-risk profile. Fourth, test exploits in a controlled environment or with extreme caution on the target, always being prepared to halt the process if unintended consequences arise. Finally, meticulously document all actions, findings, and their potential impact, and report them clearly and concisely to the client. This structured approach ensures that penetration testing is conducted effectively, ethically, and legally. Question 16. Comparative studies suggest that when faced with a robust web application firewall, WAF, actively blocking common injection attempts, a penetration tester's primary objective is to identify and exploit subtle vulnerabilities or misconfigurations within the WAF's rule sets or the application's input validation logic. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of effective and ethical WAF bypass within a controlled examination environment like the OSCP? Option A. Attempting to directly exploit vulnerabilities in the WAF software itself to gain administrative access or disable its protective functions. Option B. Systematically testing a broad spectrum of known WAF bypass payloads, including various encoding schemes and character substitutions, while meticulously observing the WAF's responses to identify patterns of successful evasion. Option C. Employing brute force techniques to overwhelm the WAF with a high volume of malformed requests, hoping to trigger a denial of service condition or bypass detection through sheer volume. Option D. Focusing exclusively on client-side vulnerabilities that do not require direct interaction with the WAF server-side inspection mechanisms. The correct answer is B. Systematically testing a broad spectrum of known WAF bypass payloads, including various encoding schemes and character substitutions, while meticulously observing the WAF's responses to identify patterns of successful evasion. Explanation. Scenario analysis. The scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing. A web application firewall, WAF, is actively blocking common attack vectors. The professional challenge lies in identifying effective bypass techniques that are both technically sound and ethically compliant within the OSCP examination's strict guidelines. Over-reliance on brute force or noisy methods can lead to detection, failure of the exam objective, and potentially violate the spirit of responsible disclosure and ethical hacking. The need for a nuanced, analytical approach to WAF bypass is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a methodical, layered strategy that leverages an understanding of WAF logic and common evasion techniques. This includes detailed reconnaissance of the WAF's behavior, identifying specific rule sets that are being triggered, and then crafting payloads that circumvent these rules without triggering broader detection mechanisms. This might involve encoding, obfuscation, character substitution, or exploiting specific WAF parsing vulnerabilities. This represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a deep technical understanding of WAFs and a commitment to stealthy, effective penetration testing, aligning with the OSCP emphasis on practical, real-world skills and ethical conduct. It respects the target's security posture while still achieving the examination objective. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to indiscriminately apply a wide array of known WAF bypass payloads without prior analysis. This is ethically problematic as it can be overly aggressive, potentially causing unintended disruption or triggering more sophisticated detection systems, which goes against the principle of minimizing impact. It also demonstrates a lack of analytical skill, a core tenet of the OSCP. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on client-side manipulation or client-side vulnerabilities that do not directly interact with the WAF server-side inspection. While client-side attacks are valid in penetration testing, they do not address the WAF bypass objective directly and would be considered a failure to meet the specific requirements of the question. This shows a misunderstanding of the problem's scope and a lack of targeted effort. A third incorrect approach involves attempting to disable or directly attack the WAF infrastructure itself. This is outside the scope of typical penetration testing engagements and certainly beyond the boundaries of the OSCP exam. Such actions would be considered unauthorized access and a severe ethical and regulatory violation, akin to attempting to compromise the testing environment's integrity. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach WAF bypass by first understanding the WAF's behavior through careful observation and testing of common payloads. This involves identifying what is being blocked and why. Subsequently, they should research and apply evasion techniques that are specific to the observed WAF behavior and the target application's context. This iterative process of testing, analyzing, and refining payloads is crucial. Ethical considerations dictate that the approach should be as stealthy and non-disruptive as possible, focusing on achieving the objective without causing collateral damage or triggering unnecessary alerts. Question 17. Quality control measures reveal that a candidate attempting to demonstrate a buffer overflow exploit on a designated OSCP lab target system has identified a potential vulnerability. The candidate has a choice of several methods to proceed with the exploit. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the professional and ethical standards expected of an offensive security certified professional? Option A. Develop and test a proof-of-concept exploit that achieves the intended objective, e.g., code execution, without causing any system instability, data corruption, or denial of service, and document the process thoroughly. Option B. Focus solely on identifying the buffer size and offset without attempting to execute any code, as this minimizes risk but does not fully demonstrate exploit capability. Option C. Immediately execute a payload designed to overwrite critical system files, aiming for a complete system compromise to prove the exploit's effectiveness. Option D. Attempt to exploit the buffer overflow with a generic shellcode that has a high probability of crashing the system, as this demonstrates a clear understanding of the overflow's impact. The correct answer is C. Immediately execute a payload designed to overwrite critical system files, aiming for a complete system compromise to prove the exploit's effectiveness. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent risks associated with exploiting buffer overflow vulnerabilities in a live, production environment. The primary challenge lies in balancing the need to demonstrate a successful exploit for the OSCP certification with the absolute imperative to avoid causing disruption, data loss, or security breaches that could have severe legal and ethical ramifications. The OSCP exam, by its nature, simulates real-world penetration testing scenarios, demanding a high degree of technical proficiency coupled with responsible conduct. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes safety, legality, and ethical conduct above all else. By meticulously analyzing the target system, understanding the specific buffer overflow vulnerability, and developing a non-disruptive exploit that achieves the objective without impacting system availability or data integrity, the candidate demonstrates a mature understanding of penetration testing principles. This aligns with the ethical guidelines of cybersecurity professionals, which emphasize minimizing harm and acting with integrity. The OSCP certification itself implicitly requires adherence to these principles, as successful completion signifies not just technical skill, but also responsible application of that skill. An incorrect approach that involves directly executing a destructive payload without prior analysis or containment measures would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Such an action could lead to unauthorized system modification, denial of service, or data corruption, all of which are illegal and unethical. This would violate the implicit trust placed in penetration testers to act responsibly and could result in legal penalties, reputational damage, and a failure to achieve the OSCP certification. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to exploit a vulnerability without understanding its full impact, demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for potential consequences. This could lead to unintended system instability or security breaches, again violating ethical and potentially legal standards. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough risk assessment. This involves understanding the potential impact of any action on the target system and its users. Next, a clear objective must be defined, ensuring that the exploit aims to achieve a specific, authorized outcome without collateral damage. The development and testing of the exploit should be conducted in a controlled manner, ideally in a simulated environment, before any deployment on a live target. Finally, continuous monitoring and the ability to immediately halt or reverse any adverse effects are crucial components of responsible penetration testing. Question 18. To address the challenge of demonstrating a format string vulnerability in a controlled lab environment without causing system instability or unauthorized data access, which of the following approaches best exemplifies responsible and effective exploitation within the OSCP examination's regulatory framework? Option A. Attempting to overwrite the return address on the stack to gain arbitrary code execution and establish a reverse shell, regardless of potential system instability. Option B. Crafting a format string exploit that targets a non-critical memory address to leak a small, non-sensitive piece of information, and ensuring the exploit can be cleanly terminated without altering system state. Option C. Using the format string vulnerability to repeatedly write to a specific memory location, aiming to trigger a denial of service condition to prove the vulnerability impact. Option D. Modifying the format string to read arbitrary memory locations indiscriminately, hoping to uncover sensitive system configurations or credentials. The correct answer is B. Crafting a format string exploit that targets a non-critical memory address to leak a small, non-sensitive piece of information, and ensuring the exploit can be cleanly terminated without altering system state. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent risks associated with exploiting format string vulnerabilities in a live, production environment. The primary challenge lies in balancing the need to demonstrate the vulnerability and its potential impact with the absolute imperative to avoid causing disruption, data loss, or unauthorized access, which would constitute a severe breach of ethical and professional conduct, and potentially violate the OSCP exam's strict adherence to its own defined regulatory framework and guidelines. The OSCP exam's framework emphasizes responsible disclosure and ethical hacking practices, meaning any exploitation must be contained, non-destructive, and strictly within the defined scope of the exercise. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes containment and minimal impact. By carefully crafting a format string exploit that targets a specific, non-critical memory location or function for demonstration purposes, and by ensuring the exploit can be cleanly reverted or has no lasting effect, the candidate adheres to the OSCP ethical guidelines. This demonstrates an understanding that security testing, even in a simulated environment, must be conducted with a high degree of control and responsibility, mirroring real-world penetration testing where client systems must be protected. This approach aligns with the implicit regulatory framework of the OSCP, which mandates ethical conduct and adherence to the spirit of responsible security assessment. An incorrect approach that involves overriding critical system memory, attempting to gain arbitrary code execution without explicit permission, or causing a denial of service would represent significant regulatory and ethical failures. Such actions would directly contravene the OSCP emphasis on ethical hacking and responsible disclosure. They would demonstrate a lack of understanding of the potential consequences of exploiting vulnerabilities, even in a controlled exam setting. This could be seen as a failure to uphold the professional standards expected of an OSCP-certified individual, potentially leading to disqualification from the exam, and a breach of the trust placed in candidates to act ethically. The OSCP framework, by its nature, implicitly governs the conduct of its candidates, and actions that cause harm or unauthorized access, even in a simulated environment, are fundamentally against its principles. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough risk assessment before attempting any exploit. This includes understanding the target system, the specific vulnerability, and the potential impact of various exploitation techniques. The candidate must then select an exploitation method that achieves the objective, demonstrating the vulnerability, with the lowest possible risk of collateral damage. If any doubt exists about the potential impact, the safest course of action is to refrain from exploitation or to seek clarification within the exam's defined communication channels. This iterative process of assessment, planning, execution, and verification is crucial for maintaining professional integrity and adhering to ethical and regulatory standards. Question 19. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to assess the effectiveness of our vulnerability scanning procedures using Nessus and OpenVAS. During a simulated penetration test, you are tasked with identifying exploitable weaknesses in a designated network segment. However, you notice a potentially vulnerable server that is adjacent to the target segment but not explicitly included in the scope. This server is known to host critical, but non-production services. What is the most professional and ethically sound approach to addressing this situation? Option A. Proceed with a low-intensity scan of the adjacent server using OpenVAS, assuming it is acceptable due to its non-production status and the potential for significant findings. Option B. Immediately scan the adjacent server with Nessus to identify its vulnerabilities, as it represents a potential pivot point and a valuable discovery. Option C. Ignore the adjacent server entirely, as it falls outside the explicitly defined scope of the penetration test, and focus solely on the authorized targets. Option D. Document the presence of the adjacent server and its potential vulnerability, and report it to the engagement manager for a scope modification request before proceeding with any scanning. The correct answer is B. Immediately scan the adjacent server with Nessus to identify its vulnerabilities, as it represents a potential pivot point and a valuable discovery. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for comprehensive vulnerability identification with the potential for disruption, and the ethical imperative to operate within defined scopes and authorizations. The OSCP certification emphasizes practical, hands-on skills within a simulated, yet realistic, adversarial environment. Therefore, the professional challenge lies in demonstrating proficiency in using tools like Nessus and OpenVAS to uncover vulnerabilities without exceeding authorized boundaries or causing unintended consequences, which could have legal and ethical ramifications even in a simulated exercise. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it adheres strictly to the principles of authorized penetration testing. This involves clearly defining the scope of the engagement, obtaining explicit permission for all scanning activities, and employing a methodology that prioritizes stealth and minimal impact where appropriate, especially when dealing with potentially sensitive systems. This aligns with the ethical guidelines expected of OSCP-certified professionals, which mandate operating within legal and authorized parameters. The OSCP exam itself is designed to test these very principles, ensuring that candidates understand the importance of responsible disclosure and authorized access. An incorrect approach that involves scanning systems outside the defined scope or without explicit authorization is a direct violation of ethical hacking principles and the foundational requirements of the OSCP. Such actions could be construed as unauthorized access, even in a simulated environment, and demonstrate a lack of professional judgment and adherence to the rules of engagement. This directly contravenes the spirit of the OSCP, which is to train ethical and responsible security professionals. Another incorrect approach, such as performing overly aggressive or disruptive scans without prior risk assessment or communication, fails to demonstrate an understanding of the potential impact on target systems. While the OSCP encourages thoroughness, it also implicitly requires a degree of finesse and consideration for the operational environment. Uncontrolled, high-intensity scanning can lead to system instability or denial of service, which is counterproductive to the goal of identifying vulnerabilities in a controlled manner and can be ethically problematic. The professional reasoning process for navigating such situations should involve a clear understanding of the engagement scope and objectives. Before commencing any scanning, a thorough review of the rules of engagement is paramount. This includes identifying authorized targets, permitted scanning techniques, and any specific restrictions. When in doubt, seeking clarification from the engagement manager or client is essential. The OSCP emphasizes a methodical approach, starting with reconnaissance and information gathering, followed by targeted scanning, and then exploitation. This phased approach allows for more controlled and less disruptive assessment, ensuring that all actions are justifiable and within the authorized framework. Professionals must prioritize ethical conduct and legal compliance above all else, even when faced with the temptation to explore beyond the defined boundaries. Question 20. Market research demonstrates that organizations increasingly rely on robust manual vulnerability assessments to identify critical security weaknesses. In the context of the Offensive Security Certified Professional (OSCP) examination, which simulates real-world penetration testing scenarios, a candidate is tasked with identifying vulnerabilities in a provided target environment. The examination strictly defines the scope of authorized targets and prohibits any activity outside the scope. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the OSCP regulatory framework and ethical guidelines for conducting a manual vulnerability assessment? Option A. Systematically analyzing the provided target systems through manual inspection of configurations, application logic, and source code where available, meticulously documenting all findings and potential impacts within the defined scope. Option B. Attempting to exploit any discovered vulnerability immediately without prior, in-depth manual analysis or documentation of its existence and potential impact. Option C. Utilizing automated vulnerability scanners to perform a broad sweep of the entire network segment, including systems not explicitly listed in the examination scope, to identify any potential vulnerabilities. Option D. Focusing solely on network-level enumeration and port scanning, without delving into application-specific logic or configuration analysis, as this is the most efficient way to cover the target. The correct answer is A. Systematically analyzing the provided target systems through manual inspection of configurations, application logic, and source code where available, meticulously documenting all findings and potential impacts within the defined scope. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a security professional to balance the immediate need for vulnerability identification with the strict regulatory and ethical obligations inherent in the OSCP examination. The core challenge lies in ensuring that all testing activities strictly adhere to the defined scope and methodology, as mandated by the examination's governing body, without deviating into unauthorized or unethical practices. The OSCP framework, like many professional certifications, emphasizes a structured and compliant approach to penetration testing. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with the OSCP emphasis on manual, in-depth analysis within a defined scope. This method ensures that the candidate demonstrates a thorough understanding of vulnerability identification techniques, including code review and configuration analysis, as required by the exam. Adhering to the exam's specific rules and guidelines is paramount, as any deviation could lead to disqualification and represents a failure to meet the certification's core competency requirements. This disciplined approach mirrors real-world professional engagements where scope adherence and ethical conduct are non-negotiable. An incorrect approach that involves scanning a broader network than specified in the exam instructions represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This constitutes unauthorized access and activity, which is a direct violation of the OSCP rules of engagement and ethical hacking principles. Such an action could be construed as malicious intent, even within an examination context, and would undermine the integrity of the certification process. It demonstrates a lack of discipline and respect for the established boundaries, which are critical for professional security practitioners. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to exploit a vulnerability without first documenting its discovery and impact through manual analysis, fails to meet the OSCP requirement for a comprehensive assessment. While exploitation is a part of penetration testing, the exam specifically tests the ability to identify and analyze vulnerabilities manually. Bypassing this analytical step and jumping directly to exploitation, without proper justification and documentation within the exam's framework, shows a disregard for the structured learning objectives of the OSCP. It prioritizes a potentially superficial outcome over the demonstration of deep analytical skill. A professional reasoning framework for similar situations involves a clear understanding of the defined scope and objectives. Before commencing any testing, a professional must thoroughly review all provided documentation, rules, and guidelines. During the assessment, continuous self-monitoring is crucial to ensure all actions remain within the authorized boundaries. If any ambiguity arises, the professional should seek clarification through the designated channels rather than making assumptions or proceeding with unauthorized actions. The OSCP, in particular, demands meticulous adherence to its examination parameters, making this disciplined approach essential for success and ethical conduct.